First of all, just a warm welcome to everyone who's joining us tonight on behalf of our Mission Education Committee and our city's working group. We're glad you're here, and we want to welcome all the members of our larger River Falls community and our friends across the country and members of the church across the country as well for this evening with Ron Lowey. We are really grateful to Ron and all the Lowey family for joining us this evening and making this possible. James Lowey, as most of you know by now, was born in this community in River Falls and in a family home he grew up in at Lewis and Maple. Some of you know where that is. He and his family were very active here at First Congregational for many years when Pastor Murner was here. And Pastor Murner, some of you may know, just celebrated his 100th birthday. So we wish him the best. James' brother Don was ordained in this congregation in 1961 and served much of his ministry in Greeley, Colorado. We're glad for his gifts to ministry coming out of this community as well. James graduated from University of Wisconsin River Falls in 1959, and he went on to Harvard and earned a PhD. He was active in sit-ins with the civil rights movement and then served as an official with the Justice Department with movement leaders, including Dr. King. And he went on to a distinguished international career committed to peace and reconciliation. He was instrumental in forming the groundwork for the United States Institute for Peace. And I'm sure Ron will share more of that great story with us. James was returned to River Falls on his death in 1993, and he rests now in Greenwood Cemetery after a service of commemoration and Thanksgiving here at the church led by Pastor Perman, who many of us in this church know well, and who now lives out in Seattle. So the roots of James Lowey and the Lowey family here in River Falls are deep and abiding, and we're certainly grateful for all of that they have done over the years to carry that faith commitment along and all of their commitments to serve in the cause of peace and racial justice across this country and across the world. And of course, tonight we're most grateful for Ron Lowey joining us from St. Louis. Ron is Senior Assistant Dean at the School of Engineering at Washington University. He's spent most of his life in St. Louis and lives there with his family. And we are so glad that he's going to be able to share the story of his father and your family, Ron, and we look forward to our time together with you. We will have about 30 minutes or so with Ron to share that story with us. And we'll have adequate time for questions and conversation online, if you will, after Ron is done, and we'll seek to wrap up within the hour. So Ron, we again thank you for joining us and welcome this evening. So you may take it away from here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Pastor Dave and Pastor Chris, for that warm welcome. I certainly do appreciate it. Everyone can hear me okay? I hope. Thumbs up, Dave, if that's the case.
What's that?
We're good, everyone. You can hear me, Dave, okay?
Yes, I can hear you. I hope everybody else can.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I certainly couldn't agree more about our roots running deep in River Falls. And as a result, I feel right at home speaking with you today. I also just want to express a debt of gratitude to First Congregational Church for asking me to do this. Isn't it interesting how we often tell ourselves that, you know, we need to go through some of the old history of our family and kind of dig out those records and see what their life was like and what that means for our life. And speaking to you all now gave me the opportunity to do just that. So I do appreciate that. Yes, James Lowey was a life committed to racial justice and reconciliation. And really what I hope to do tonight is to weave a little bit of his bigger picture and his bigger narrative and career into the River Falls and First Congregational story. I find it very interesting with someone of his intelligence. What was the environment like that cultivated his interest to do the life's work that he did? And certainly, it's a compelling story when you look at all the experiences he had in River Falls. So I do certainly want to talk a little bit about those formative years to give a sense of background for everyone. I would certainly like to highlight some of his work with Dr. King and how that gave the seeds of his life's work in racial justice and reconciliation. After that time, Dad went into conflict resolution and worked in academia for many years. But one of the, I would say, crowning achievements and one of his main goals was for the creation of the U.S. Institute of Peace. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then again, wrap it up with what all this means to us today. So as Pastor Chris had said, please don't hesitate to put any questions in the chat. After this presentation, I would welcome it being as conversational as possible. So there they are. That is the Laue clan. Around 1946, this picture taken in River Falls. So that is my Uncle Don, and as Pastor Dave said, he went on for a distinguished career in the UCC, and he was indeed ordained at First Congregational. And then of course there's my Aunt Ann. Aunt Ann is here tonight, and you are the glue of the family, I would have to say. Who really keeps that connection with all of us, and in her own right is doing some significant community-based outreach and work in social justice in the Twin Cities area. I'm so glad that my Aunt Ann has stayed in the area of the Twin Cities because it allows us to visit often and to visit River Falls. And then there's Dad. Dad was the middle child. Although you wouldn't know it, he never liked labels. In fact, if you were to ask him what effect did it have on him being the middle child, he'd say, I don't know, I don't really believe in labels. Let's go on to the next topic. I just believe what we can do to help others. And that's really what he wanted to focus on in his life. I often would ask Dad about what his childhood was like. I did not grow up in a small town, and I wondered how much it differed from me. I remember in high school, as I was going through trials and tribulations, as most do during the high school years, as I asked him what his childhood was like, he very matter-of-factly said it was carefree, it was loving, it was inclusive. To be honest with you, I had a very carefree childhood. One thing he did not say that his childhood was boring. He was always very active in anything that he did. He lived in River Falls when he was born in 1937 and through 1959, and just highlighting some of the aspects that I have learned after, of course, talking with Dad, but also my aunt and uncle and family members. My grandparents, Jane and Roy Lowey. Roy was a dentist for many years right there on Main Street. Jane was very active in the community, and the message was that everyone was welcome. They were welcome at their house. They were welcome to interact in so many parts of the community, and there was an expectation that their kids would treat all others with respect, no matter who they were. In the 1940s and early 1950s, they walked everywhere in River Falls. As was mentioned, Dad grew up right there at the corner of Maple and Lewis, right near downtown. My grandpa Laue walked to his dentist practice each day, walked back for lunch. On Sundays, the family would walk the 3.5 blocks to the Congregational church right across the way from the Kinnickinnick. And they didn't have a car, and there was no TV back then. But somehow they managed to be okay. In fact, I would often ask my dad, how did you do it? No TV, no car? I mean, was that difficult? And he would just look at me with the way that Dad could do and say, well, I turned out okay. I guess I can do it. That was Dad. Dad was involved He was involved in several student organizations. He was involved in the Cub Scouts, as you can see from this picture. I love this picture here. Looks a little bit staged as they are all kind of working methodically on the task at hand, as I see my dad is doing there. He was also a member of the newspaper at his high school, and he talked quite a bit about his time in the marching band, how close he was with his fellow students. I believe that they would travel to different competitions around the state, and that had a lasting impact on the parades that he participated in as the drummer down Main Street in River Falls. I've heard stories about how he took that so seriously, wanted to make sure that he was on time at the right place because the whole band was counting on him to be in step as the drummer. But then there's another experience that Dad talked about in high school that I think gave the first glimmer that made him into the person who he was. My grandmother, and this is confirmed by my aunt and uncle, there was a time when they would host international students. And Dad talked of a story that while he was in high school, he served as a guide and interpreter for a Hungarian student who was visiting. And this student wore different kind of clothes and talked a different kind of way. Of course, very appropriate for his culture, but a little different in River Falls. And he recalls times when that Hungarian student would be made fun of. And I think something just wasn't right in my father's brain. He couldn't understand it. To him, you treat others with respect, no matter who they are. And he was not shy to speak out about how that was not correct, about treating this other individual just because they were different from you. My Aunt Ann said, and my Uncle Don confirmed, the church raised us. Really, everything at that time revolved around First Congregational. I believe that River Falls was between 2,000 and 3,000 citizens at the time, and really the center of activity was with the church. And how impressionable it could be for young kids. And boy, were there a lot of kids at that time. And my father would often talk about those early opportunities for public expression in a safe place. That's what the church should be. He gave many talks. I believe he gave a sermon a few times. I was able to discover some write-ups he did for the Pilgrim Fellowship, which I learned happened every week at First Congregational, I believe Monday evenings. And so many students were heavily involved in those kind of engaging activities. And even at the state and national level, I believe they went to different conferences in Eau Claire and in Milwaukee that were related to the Pilgrim Fellowship. And then, as was mentioned, there's the influential role models that come from the church. And that certainly did include Pastor Jack Murner, who, again, just celebrated being 100 years young back in October, I believe. So impressionable at that age, kids are. And I am reminded that when you grow up with those incredible, influential mentors as a child, that's what makes for that carefree and solid adulthood that my father enjoyed. So certainly indebted to First Congregational for doing that, because I think that did set the foundation for his later work. You know, I learned in River Falls at that time that people really did for one another and no one had to be on top. Everyone worked together. Let me just give you a few examples that were given to me. I believe in 1955, a new parsonage was built. My uncle recalls the story about how all the high school kids and middle school kids pitched in. They helped with the landscaping. They helped with what needed to be done to get things ready for the pastor. And as a result of doing those things, they could be part of the larger goal and the larger picture, and they could see how their actions really did make a difference. I think that is incredibly important. But I also think that the world is a little bit different right now. I think that there is times where people look at who's on top, who's in charge, where the hierarchy is, and that can be difficult. That can be demoralizing for many. And I think that is something that my father and others growing up at that time in River Falls didn't have to deal with as much as the children of today do. So I gave a lot of thought to this. So what was it? You know, you have a person of great intelligence. How do you create an environment that is conducive for growth in a helpful manner? So let's look at some of the characteristics of my dad. Some of them are funny. I hope they can bring a smile to some of your face as they do for me. He was indeed intelligent, but he was curious and he was energetic. And I do believe that that could be challenging for my grandparents at times. So they really had to give him productive outlets, right? They had to give him an opportunity, a space to learn, to grow, because he just wasn't one of those kids that was going to be able to sit still for too long. He was never afraid to question. He had great confidence. And if he saw something that he didn't seem was right, he would ask about it. But with that questioning, he was taught to be respectful. I think that's a little different than it is today. I think it is possible to question, to focus on maybe the problem, but not insult the person. And he was very careful. And as he got his point across, Dad would work very hard to at times use humor, certainly at times to use logic, but always be respectful. Dad challenged rules and policy, which he disagreed with. Maybe this comes back to his confusion at why someone would question someone from Hungary who would dress differently than him. And he was not shy about questioning that. But in a place like River Falls, you had a safety net when you failed or when you made a mistake, and you were given opportunities to develop your skills in different ways to be impactful. I believe it was my aunt, but probably my grandma, who said that Dad was always 5 steps ahead. You could always tell where Jim had been because he had left a trail in the house of different things. I'm sure members of my family can relate to this as well. And as a result, it did take patience. Sometimes it does take patience working with someone who maybe thinks on a different level. Certainly that loving patience that comes from a family. And then he had that desire to find ways to impact the social justice in the world. And this is where really his transition from high school to the University of Wisconsin, River Falls really had an impact. Perhaps many of you know the name Professor Bob Bailey. He was a professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. I believe it was called University State College then. But Dad told stories of how impressed he was with Professor Bailey and how he looked at him as a role model and said, you know what, I can do that. I can teach sociology, and that is what I want to do. And certainly the influence and being ahead of its time for the University of Wisconsin, River Falls to hire Professor Bailey in the 1950s, as he was an African-American gentleman teaching in a town that was largely white. So after Dad graduated in 1959 from the University of Wisconsin, then he was ready. He took the aspects of his childhood from River Falls, and he was ready to see the larger world. It wasn't necessarily that he wanted to get out of River Falls. He just knew that there was more out there. And as a result, in the fall of 1959, he packed his bags, got on the train, and headed to Boston, where he went to graduate school at Harvard for a PhD in sociology. And I think an interesting point here, I don't think that he went to Harvard because it was Harvard for the namesake. He looked into what the different sociology programs were doing across the country, and he had this real interest in what was happening at Harvard in the sociology of social justice. And I think that that's why he landed there. So it was at Harvard, but certainly before, but at Harvard, where he was keenly aware of what was exploding at the time within the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Yes, he was aware of the bus boycott that had happened 5 years earlier in 1959. He was aware of the work that Dr. King had done And as a sociology student, he wanted to study this social movement that was focused on non-violent social change. And for him, the way to do that was to be in the movement. He did his dissertation on this topic of direct action and desegregation from 1960 to 1962. And the method he used is something in sociology called a participant observer. He had to be where the movement was happening in order to understand it. And as a result, he was often with the Black community at these different events, from the sit-ins that happened in North Carolina to Albany in 1962, to Selma in 1965, and in Chicago in 1966. It is where he really learned the techniques of conflict resolution and the importance of using these methods if we really want social change, as opposed to just loving peace to death, as he often would say. We need to be given the tools to actually make peace happen. Dad was a passionate person. He was passionate about different causes, and my goodness, was he passionate about what was going on in the civil rights movement, and passionate about the injustice in the Black community. But with that passion, Dad was not intimidated about sharing that with others. And I think this is another important point with Dad, something that I always admired. I never knew how he did it. He just seemed to never be intimidated. He told this story at Harvard about how during the class that he entered, he was the only student in the sociology graduate department who came from a public state institution. Everyone else probably was from Ivy Leagues or these bigger name schools, and Dad didn't care a thing about it. It didn't bother him. At times he would be asked about it, but he was too much focused on the next step, the next cause of social justice, that he didn't have time to worry about those hierarchical and stratified nature that some people like to do when they put others in a box. So Dad first started working with Dr. King as a student, and then eventually as a helper. He wanted to help the process. And then after he graduated from Harvard, he actually started working for the Community Relations Service under the Department of Justice. This is when the family was living in Washington, D.C. Before I was born. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the tragedy in April of 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, as it relates to my father and his work with Dr. King. So the Memphis sanitation strike had been going on since late 1967 and on into early parts of 1968. And really the protest was about unfair working conditions of Black workers compared to their white counterparts. Over the course of those few months, tensions began to rise. And in March, 2 African-American sanitation workers were killed as the result of unsafe working conditions. And the National Guard was called. And the presence of Martin Luther King also illuminated what was going on in Memphis. And my dad wanted to be there. This was common for him, and he asked his boss in Washington if he could go down to Memphis and work with what was going on with the sanitation strike. And he arrived there, I believe, in early April. On April 3rd, Martin Luther King arrived. He had been there the month before, but he arrived that day. And that evening, he actually gave the famous I've been to the mountaintop speech, probably his second most famous speech after the I Have a Dream. And this is where he talked about not having any fear. He quoted the Bible. He explained that he had been to the mountaintop, said, "Thine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." And so this night he was not fearing any man. Dad often talked about that speech. He was in the church that evening, and he said at the end, he talked to Andrew Young at the back of church after that speech, and he said, you know, I never heard Dr. King talk like that. He was not as optimistic as he often is. And Dad often wondered if he knew that King was aware that there may be something dangerous coming. Dad was staying at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, which was not uncommon because that was a Black-owned hotel. And again, as I mentioned, he wanted to be part of the movement. You can see in this picture here, if you look at this corner room right here, this is 306. This is where Dr. King was staying on April 4th. And then 2 doors down is room 308, and this is where Dad was staying. On April 4th, it was a day that started like the last 2 days for Dad. He had been in several meetings throughout the day related to the movement that was happening. Oh, is there a question? No, we're good. Related to the movement that was happening. And after that round of meetings, he returned to his hotel room just in time, as he put it, to hear the 6 o'clock news. He walked into his hotel room in 308. He turned on the TV and he heard the reports from the round of judicial hearings that had happened earlier that day. And then it happened. It was 6:02 p.m. and Dad heard an incredibly loud boom right outside his door. He had thought that someone perhaps had thrown a cherry bomb into the courtyard. He immediately opened his door. He looked to his right and he saw Dr. King on the ground, on the balcony, already in a pool of blood. He quickly ran back into his room in an attempt to render any aid he could. He brought out some towels and he placed them on Dr. King's neck. Right after that, he realized the blood was coming so much, he ran back into his room to get more towels for Dr. King. And I believe that that is when this famous picture was taken. So you can see Dr. King here on the ground with the towels that my father had brought. This door right here is the door right next to the one of where my father was staying. And Dad used to tell the story that as he was running back and forth, he actually stubbed his toe on this wheel here. And it was something that was a reminder of that horrible day. Dad ran back out with some towels, and I believe that this is the next scene that happened. This picture I actually did not discover until just a few years ago when I visited the Lorraine Motel with my son and saw this picture hanging on the wall. And I just took this picture with my camera. There's some uncertainty if that is Dad, but given the sequence of where people are, I really do think it is. He was wearing a white shirt. It just looks like his posture. You'll notice that Andrew Young is there kneeling down, Ralph Abernathy. The police officer is not there yet, and Jesse Jackson is not there yet either. This next picture here, after other pictures began to be taken, you can see Dad kneeling right there with the towels from his room, and you can see that Jesse Jackson has arrived as well as a police officer. This picture was actually taken from the ground level looking up at the balcony. You can see how Dad just got back. He had loosened his tie but hadn't taken it off yet when the shot was fired. And then this picture here is the assistance in bringing Dr. King to the ambulance. Dad would tell the story that right after he helped get Dr. King into the ambulance, that is where he felt this tremendous sense of grief. That's when it hit him exactly what had happened at that moment. Up to that point, it was just kind of the chaos that was ensuing. He didn't think too long because he realized he needed to quickly see if he could call his boss back at the Department of Justice to explain what had happened. Dad talked about how he was very fortunate to get 2 of the telephone lines in the lobby of the hotel to call Washington, D.C. First, he called his boss, Roger Wilkins, in the community relations office. He had not arrived home yet. So because he could not talk with Mr. Wilkins, he called Attorney General Ramsey Clark, the Attorney General at the time. And then Ramsey Clark then called the White House. And this allowed the president and the White House to be informed of what had happened before the media had gotten word of what had happened. So I will put a little plug in that if you ever find yourself in Memphis, I do recommend visiting the National Civil Rights Museum. They can do such a better job than I can here to really walk through the events of the 60s and the nonviolent social change that was being pursued at that time, really in a chronological order. It's a fantastic museum, and it does culminate with that terrible day on April 4th, 1968. When I was there with my son, we did take a picture of this room. There is some significance to this, which I'll share with you in just a second. But recently I was back in Memphis on business, and I took this picture. This gives you a little bit better view of the layout of the Lorraine Motel. Again, this was Dr. King's room. This room right here is where my father was staying. And interestingly, as part of the museum was actually built around the Lorraine Motel. It's behind the Lorraine Motel. And in order for guests to view Dr. King's room, the museum actually hollowed out this room here, which is 307. So visitors enter from the back of that room. They can look right into the glass plate that was Dr. King's room, and it is set up in a way that looked like it did on that night in 1968. And then to keep things from being claustrophobic, I believe, they also put a glass wall that looks into the room of 308. And yes, 308 is the room that Dad was staying in. I was incredibly shocked when I walked through the museum and I saw that I could look into the very room that Dad was staying at that night. I had that vision of him turning on this TV, of hearing that loud bang, of running back and forth here, getting towels to do what he could. When I took this picture here, I thought it gave a very good angle of the room. And you'll notice if you look closely, recently our family donated a brick in Dad's memory for the 50th anniversary of the shooting in 1968. And you may or may not be able to read that, but it says, "In memory of Dr. James H. Laue, dedicated to peace and conflict resolution." And the symbolism on the placement of this brick is not lost on me. If you look here, it almost is as if the brick is pointing directly up to the exact spot that my father was kneeling when he was trying to aid Dr. King in those last moments. So what did that mean for Dad? I think it was an incredible turning point, not just the experience of that terrible day, but the influence that Dr. King had on Dad. And I think it did spark something in him that he needs to make the world a better place as a result of what he has experienced. And he actually used to use that very line, "I want to leave the world better than I found it." This is something that Dad wrote in April of 1993 when he wrote about the experience then 25 years ago. And he said, "The King taught me that conflict resolution, a laudable goal on the surface, does not truly occur without struggle refined in love, and that justice is not fulfilled without reconciliation." A lot of what he is saying is that conflict resolution doesn't come easy. You have to work for it. And that is certainly what he did within his life. The next several years, building on the foundation of Dr. King, he worked in academia, and he also worked towards the establishment of the United States Institute of Peace. So he had various appointments at Rollins College, at Emory, at Harvard, and also at Washington University in St. Louis, where I happen to work right now. Life does come full circle. And then it was in 1987 where, as a family, we moved from St. Louis to right outside of Washington, D.C., where my dad took a position as the first endowed professorial chair in the field of conflict resolution. This was something that was so important to him because a field of conflict resolution such as a field of sociology or a field of psychology, have been developed. Its time had come that it was important enough that we said we need to start learning and understanding these techniques of conflict resolution so we can not just talk about love and peace, but we can actually make it happen. With that momentum of working in those different areas, he was recognized by President Jimmy Carter in the late 1970s as someone who might help in the efforts to establish a National Academy of Peace, an academy that would teach peacemaking techniques, and President Carter asked him to co-chair that committee. So this is one of the early meetings, a quote that I used to love from Dad, and there are many, but he used to say, as I asked him about the Peace Institute, he said, you know what? We have institutions that study war. We have colleges that study war. We have a incredible budget at the Pentagon that studies war, which is important to understand these different things. But why don't we have an institution that studies peace? And parts of those early meetings, as he met with Jimmy Carter and others on the commission, this is what set the seeds for working towards building what became the United States Institute of Peace. Over those years, he campaigned in many ways. He did what professors do. He wrote articles. He tried to get his point across of the merits of peace and conflict studies, and he worked very hard to bring about the Institute of Peace. And let me just bring it full circle for you. Change happens at the local level, he would often talk about, and he asked River Falls to help pitch in to try to support the U.S. Peace Academy. And look what I found in my records. I found some editorials, things written to the River Falls Journal about the need for a Peace Academy. Here we are in River Falls, Wisconsin, and we knew the importance of this. I do believe that I saw a Barbara Peterson possibly on the call. I don't know if it is the same one. If it is, but and all others who helped Dad push that through, I am forever grateful. Because of the work at the local level, including River Falls, we have this. This is the United States Institute of Peace. If you ever find yourself in Washington, D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial, just walk a block north and you will run into this, the building with the large peace stub on top. So proud of the work that Dad did with the help of others to make this happen. Lessons that are relevant for today. We talked a little bit about the accepted techniques of peace and conflict. Those are relatively new. They were even more new back then, just 20 years old, but they're used in so many different areas, from labor negotiations to school desegregation to inmate grievances. But again, Dad stressed the local level. You don't have to do what he did to really make an impact. I would have to say that he was a little ahead of his time. He even talked about some of the possible problems in the criminal justice system, including questioning of citizen review boards for police departments. Yes, we are living in difficult times. The murder of George Floyd has really brought to the forefront our need to continue the fight for peace and conflict in our communities. And let me close just by saying, yes, Dad left River Falls in 1959, but it never left him. He would frequently visit back. He would do different things in River Falls, and my gosh, he loved his hometown. And he was actually recognized for the Distinguished Alumni Award. That picture there on the right that I've, an older picture of my kids there that was taken in River Falls. So his mark is certainly there. When I was looking through this article, a very interesting thing happened when I was talking with my mother. First of all, is Hope Hip such an interesting topic to talk about at the graduation in 1970, in which Dad was the commencement speaker for that year. He made Hope cool before Barack Obama did. So again, Dad was ahead of his time. When I looked at this, I thought about my own existence and thought, I asked my mother, you know, I was born in April of 1970. Did you go to that event? And she said, yes. She packed up the 3 kids, 5 and under, and they all trekked out to River Falls. And I am reminded that so much of what Dad has accomplished is because the love and support of others, and certainly because of the love and support of my mom. It's interesting, as we grow up as adults, we start to understand a little bit the sacrifice that our parents did to help those we loved reach the goals that they reached. And Dad couldn't have done it without my mom and several others. I know we're pressed for time. A very, very quick story. I can't end without saying this. I want everyone to picture the summer of 1993. I had just graduated from college. I was working in downtown Washington, D.C. with the National Park Service, and Dad had just had surgery and he was recovering at home. I remember fondly coming home from work and telling Dad the stories of working on the National Mall in Washington, and he really ate it up. And then it happened. The date was August 9th, 1993. I got home that day and Dad said, "You're not going to believe what happened. The Washington Post has published an article about the Kansas City Chiefs training camp in River Falls, and they had the audacity to compare River Falls to Mayberry. I'm writing a letter to the editor right now, and I'm going to tell them what it's really like in River Falls." That night, my mom and I helped him do that very thing. Let me just read a quick excerpt from that. Dear Washington Post, as a native of River Falls, Wisconsin, the summer training camp of the Kansas City Chiefs, I became worried about the reporting of the culturally deprived Eastern media. They said if you didn't know better, you'd swear you in Mayberry when you went to River Falls. Give me a break, Dad said. River Falls is about as much like the telemythical Mayberry as Washington, D.C. is like Washington, Georgia. And he goes on to say, consider at 7:30 a.m. daily, there's a seminar at the Falls Cafe that takes on all the big issues of the day. I love to attend when I am in town. Regulars include local ministers, current and retired faculty, the former university president, business people, and well-read Wobegoниan farmers, as in Lake Wobegon. That was Dad's personality. In his mind, he thought an injustice had happened. Someone tried to depict River Falls and they didn't know what they were talking about. And it didn't matter that I came home that night and said, Dad, that was buried in the sports section of the Washington Post, probably by a young journalist who was trying to get a hook for the article. Is it really worth it? It was worth it to Dad because he wanted the truth to prevail. And he sent out that letter, which was one of the last things he did before he passed in September of 1993. Everyone, thank you so much. A picture from inside of the First Congregational Church at my Aunt Ann's wedding, my mom, my dad looking so proper, and other folks that we may recognize. I'm going to stop sharing screen now, and I believe that I need to give the reins back over to Pastor Chris here. So let me see if I can.
Yeah, Ron, while you're doing that, I just want to encourage people again to go to that bottom section there, the chat feature, and write in some questions. Dave's going to ask some questions in a little bit, but do take a couple minutes there if you've got a question, because when we have 100 people, we can't all speak at once. If you type your questions in, we've got a team here that will try to collect them and get back to you with some more questions. But before I turn it over to Dave, as a parent of 3 kids that went through the marching band here in River Falls, and I know we have multiple marching band families involved here because the Wildcats have won more marching band tournaments than any other town our size. What did your dad play? Was he a drummer?
He was indeed a drummer. He was, and he used to talk about as he was marching down Main Street, he used to have to dodge in and out of the road apples, I believe they were called, which he always thought was funny. But he was the drummer keeping everyone in line. That's right.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that. There was one question about this being recorded. Yes, it is being recorded, and we'll find a way to share that later. So I'm going to turn it over to Dave, who's got some questions, and we'll keep monitoring this chat function for a couple more minutes. We've got about time for we've got about 12, 13 minutes left. We got to unmute yourself, Dave.
There I am. Could you tell us a little bit more about your dad's international work? I noted in some of the things I've read about him, about some of the work he did internationally. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so, and I'll just say that I know my mom and brother and sister on the line. If I miss anything, certainly do chime in here. So he did some extensive consulting with President Carter, specifically with some of the hostage crisis that was happening in the Middle East back in 1979 and 80. And in addition to the Camp David Accords that Jimmy Carter helped negotiate in 1980, the agreement in the Middle East with Egypt and the PLO. Some of the effects of that are still in place today. So certainly he did that a lot on the consultation level with some of the world leaders. So those are some of the things that come to mind. But I also want to mention he did some local level negotiation as well, from tobacco use to some pollution issues in Fairfax to others. But internationally, that was one of the main things he did. My memory is that he did travel abroad quite a bit. And family members, if I missed anything, chime in.
Thank you. And I see there's a question from Barb Peterson who you referenced. Do you see that up there, Ron?
Oh, let me take a look. So
Okay, it says,
let's see.
you meet your grandmother Jane.
Did you meet your grandmother Jane? I remember her as a powerhouse personality. Our son mowed her yard for a bit and enjoyed conversations with her so much. That is a good way to put it. Yes, she was. She was a powerhouse personality. I do remember Grandma Laue very well. I had often said that maybe she should have been a phone operator because there was no one that could talk quicker than Grandma Laue. And she was often 5 steps ahead. She had a very special relationship with her kids and with Dad particularly. They had an interesting relationship where my grandpa Roy was a little bit more quiet, and he enjoyed the work that he did as a dentist, where Grandma Jane, gosh, she just was so involved in different parts of the community and was never shy about voicing up.
Good. Ron, can you see some of the other?
We've got a couple of questions about diversity. How was your family and River Falls inclusive? How diverse was River Falls at the time? And how do you think, or how would your dad think, we would create more inclusive communities today?
Yeah, it's a great question. So during Dad's early years, I don't think that there was a lot of diversity. In fact, my grandpa Don said that the first time that he and my dad saw a Black individual was when they took the bus to St. Paul and were there for the day shopping. And they didn't know what a Black person had even looked like. And in a very respectful way, of course, Grandpa pointed out that that is a Black individual, and they're no different than anyone else. I do think that River Falls is in the unique opportunity, being so close to the Twin Cities, that you can do some major change in some of the areas where there is some more systemic racism. But at the same time, I do think that when you are in a situation that is as homogeneous as sometimes can occur in a place like River Falls, it's important that you always conduct yourself as if you are talking with a diverse environment, that you always can imagine that everyone in the room is a child of God. Everyone in the world is a child of God, as Dad would often say. And in order to make real change, you are going to talk about things that are happening on distant shores or distant areas with respect, even though there may not be people who are different from you close by in River Falls.
Thanks. There's one question in here. Didn't your dad also work with the Southern Christian Leadership Council?
Yes, he did. He worked with the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and Andrew and Mom, you may know a little bit more about the work that he did, but that's where he was really integrated in some of the different social movements that were happening, and also with the community relations. And what his job was, as I remember, was to really to go into different communities, try to understand what the racial strife was happening, maybe look at some of the violence that was happening, and give proposals for how the community could be better served. Mom, go ahead. You'll have to unmute yourself. There you go.
While he was doing his research for his PhD, that is when he worked for the Southern Regional Council and other organizations, because as you mentioned, he was a participant observer. So he would become a part of these groups in order to learn what they were doing.
Dad traveled quite a bit. Right?
A lot.
Mom can attest. Again, Mom worked very hard to keep the three of us grounded, because if there was a conference, if there was a movement, if there was something happen, if he was asked to be a speaker, which he often was, he would go.
Got some questions about technology. How do you think technology today impacts the possibility of effective conflict resolution compared to 50 years ago?
Oh gosh, a great question. This is something I've thought about quite a bit. I think it makes it more difficult, to be honest with you. Not only does it give unrealistic expectations to our kids of how the world works and how we solve conflict, but it also gives us the platform for people to operate from a different set of facts, and facts that may be convenient to us, and the ability to look at things from afar and pontificate of, if those folks in that area would just do it like this, like we would do it, then everything would be okay. And that's just not how it works. So I think it is an additional burden that we all face. I think that is something that we all can work to help understand the influence that social media, that different things that get pushed to us depending on what YouTube channel we click or what like we put in our Facebook page, and how that is dependent on what comes to our screens. And we need to teach our kids that as well. I would hope that we start to demand that we need to have a better set of facts, or else we're not all working from the same vantage point. It's a great question.
Thank you for that. Charles Wolf has spent a lot of time typing a question, so I almost have to read this. As I remember your dad, who was 9 years older than I recall him as one of those to whom my parents pointed as a good role model. He played drums not only in high school band, but also in the Wisconsin State College at River Falls Band. I also recall him being a member of the cast of The Tea House of the August Moon, done at River Falls under the direction of Blanche Davis. Memory serves, he was also a sports reporter for the Student Voice. I remember asking my parents, he likes sports so much, how come he doesn't play any? The response, as I recall, was that he had a kidney problem, which would make it dangerous for him to get involved in contact sports. So he served as a reporter and the team manager. Is that an accurate memory? I wonder if I would also mention that when my parents were invited to speak at church during stewardship season about who their saints were, they named Jim Lowe, Barb DeSouza as the saints of the church.
I have read that article that was in some of the material that Mom gave. My goodness, thank you so much for taking the time to write that out. You know what? That is accurate. As you I think as folks would watch what Dad would do and how involved he was, if you look at his high school yearbook, it basically will explain of just how involved he was. Sometimes I look at the work that he has done. I'm sure my brother and sister feel the same way. We ask ourselves, what have I been doing with my time? Because he was involved in all those things. But here's one of the key points that I got out of that was so interesting. Yes, Dad did have a condition that did not allow him to participate in sports, although he loved sports. So what did he do? He did not wallow in that. He would say that, self-pity is the cancer of the soul. And my mother would say that as well. So he would just say, all right, I can't do that. What can I do? I can be the sports editor. I can be in the band. I can do this. I can do that. And he was just one to never stop, but continue to put one foot in front of the other, all the way with that summer in '93 that I talked about. His goal was always getting better and getting back out there. He never, wanted to explore the idea that wouldn't happen. And that kind of inertia, I think, was something that compelled him to accomplish so much, even though he died at the young age of 56.
Just want to take one last thing here to kind of bring it all full circle about the River Falls is not Mayberry story, which I think is very funny. I said the same thing when I came to town and I found out the parking meters took pennies. So, but someone commented that River Falls may not be Mayberry, but they were talking about going to a school district meeting today dedicated to inclusivity, equity, diversity in the River Falls school system. The process is never ending, but it's still going strong in River Falls, which I think is a good way to kind of bring all this full circle. I'm going to turn it over to Dave for some final comments. Unmute yourself, Dave.
Again, I always forget that part. Thank you, Ron. It was a great presentation. Thank Andrew and Ann for your participation, all your family, and to your mom, Ms. Baker. We're so glad you were able to be here with us tonight too. And thank you for all the support you gave him and your family to make this story real. We are in the process in this community of faith of reigniting much of our work around racial justice. And it's been a pleasure to be able to spend quite a bit of time with Ron on the phone the last few weeks and months. And I look forward to doing some more of that with you too, Ron. But we know that the challenges before us are as difficult as they ever have been. And so tonight, I think we've been really inspired, Ron, by the story of your dad and your family here in this congregation. To really bring it home like this is a powerful, powerful piece for us to mull over and think about in the days ahead as we continue our work and our ministry to do what we can out of this congregation and this community to advance the kinds of commitments and causes your dad stood for, your whole family has stood for, and that we are continuing to stand for now here in this community, in the Twin Cities, as you mentioned, Ron, and far beyond. So thank you very much, Ron. Thank all of you for being with us tonight. As Chris said, we've recorded this, so we'll be glad to send that to you if you just contact the church office. And we wish each of you a good evening during these very difficult times in the story of our country and the world. Keep strong, keep faithful, keep masked. We took off our masks to be with you this evening, but they're right in front of us right now. And we hope that you will continue this journey that Mr. Lowe, Dr. Lowe started, that we will continue in the same way. So thank you all very much. Be well. Good night. God bless.
Thanks so much. Take care. God bless everyone. Thank you.